Je m'appelle Amani Loukou Charlotte. Mon village c'est Djedou en Ouzé. J'ai 7 enfants.
Soleil.
Sergio, Sergio,
ben arrivé tout bon, nom blanc Jackmon.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Passez bancaille nom blanc, nous prenez belle trois fées.
Sergio, Sergio,
ben arrivé, Tibay, aïe fout moins content. Sorti à tes foyales, moins du ou, non blanc débarqué.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, aïe nous ja swingé.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, yeppa, ou ba nous les news.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Non blanc arrivé, aïe moins content. J'ai mon tombé. Non blanc pas les payer. En moins benae. Wakriye bena soufflé. Bena kasamongo. Regardez-moi, on nous parle en foi. On parle bas, on parle bas, la on fait bail. Moi, qu'elle fait ses oies sous deux mango. Woy, 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 woy. Woy, 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 bandit. Allez, mettez votre volonté. Kita, mango.
Recording in progress.
Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer to access diverse industry data like RC
Hello.
status.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to today's session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Please note that we have the chat, which is available for your networking, and kindly use the Q&A for your questions. We are also coming to you in English with French translation. So on the bottom right corner, you find interpretation. Kindly select your language there. Before I move over to Jim Fitzpatrick, let me also acknowledge our sponsors and supporters: Intersnack, SNI, Cashew, Cashew Info, Pro Cashew, and TechnoServe Benin Cashew Project. Today, we are going to continue with the second part of the markets and cashewnomics, which was started by Jim Fitzpatrick a fortnight ago. So I see Jim with his picture. Your video is showing Jim. Hello, good morning, Jim. How are you?
Good morning.
Very good. So please take over and take us through the markets and cashewnomics too. And we are all ready for you.
Morning, everyone. This morning, we're going to talk about the market, as we always do. And we're also going to talk a little bit about processing in Africa, cashew processing in Africa, obviously. This is the second stage in our three-part series called Cashewnomics. Last time we talked about India and Vietnam, and we were focusing really on the influence of those two huge processing giants, and in the case of India, consuming giants, and the influence of those countries on the overall culture of the business, and particularly on events in African producing countries. Today, we're going to look at processing in Africa to try and draw together the strands between the influence of those two giants and the impact on processing in Africa. But first, let's have a look at the recent market developments, and let's see where we've been going. So on the crops update, first of all, in Vietnam, it seems to me now that we're probably looking at a crop of just over 300,000 tons. It seems to me, again, that the figures in Vietnam this year are very uncertain, both trade and production at the moment. But certainly production is well down on last year's record production. That, of course, as we've said many times, creates a certain kind of an agenda, an attitude amongst Vietnamese processors in sourcing their raw cashew nuts. But it doesn't actually mean a great deal in terms of the overall world supply situation, a loss of just under 4% of the overall supply. But that is in that vital period, late February, March, and into April. Moving on to India, and again, there's not an awful lot new, surprisingly, in the past 2 weeks from India. There's no doubt that the lockdowns are disrupting demand and processing. It also appears that they're disrupting any kind of crop estimations coming out. And for certain processors are naturally reluctant to make decisions. So you will see lately commentary from processors in India regarding the aggressive buying of RCN by Vietnamese processors. But actually the flip side of that is that, and understandably, Indian processors are quite reluctant to make decisions in such a difficult period. So processing of cashews can continue in India, although it is disrupted, and I guess some factories have decided not to open for the time being, depending on where they are. Demand naturally is disrupted too, and we are likely to see lower demand in the early part of the year following the pattern of last year, but not to suggest that this year in India is any way comparable to last year, this is a much more serious situation. And if we look in our largest producer, Côte d'Ivoire, I still think that the crop is below the 800,000 tons. Certainly the quality is lower now. Prices at the farm gate are off the highs, but still relatively steady. And FOB or CNF prices are steady, maybe a little bit stronger. Don't forget that much of the crop has already been committed in large deals with large Vietnamese traders, and that has its own influence on the way the market operates. I think this year has not been a year in which the sector in Côte d'Ivoire has covered itself in glory by any means, and it's made life difficult for processors on whom so much has been invested in terms of hopes and in terms indeed of money. Elsewhere, if we look at production is just getting going for the West, Guinea-Bissau. Production is well underway, but the shipments haven't really got going yet. Senegal and the Gambia, all would expect good crops. A lot of issues on freight, taxation in Guinea-Bissau. Other issues that, as always, delay the crop there. Prices ruling high at the moment in those areas, and we'll have to see how that goes, because they don't make an awful lot of sense for a processor, assuming a processor is buying a raw cashew nut with the objective of making a profit out of it. And sometimes we have to wonder about that when we see activity amongst certain processors. So let's look at RCN prices as they stand. The market has moved up a little bit. As you know, I calculate an index, and the index now is about $30 higher than it was 2 weeks ago. That's a quality adjusted index across these main four origins. As you can see, the index is the dotted line. There is a little bit of a spike up. So what we had been seeing was a decline in prices as the quality in particularly Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria had declined. Prices had started to drop away a little bit, and now it's turned back up a little bit. So there's two things influencing the index. One is the shift to a higher quality nut, which means that the available nuts are higher priced, although they may also be higher quality. And secondly, there is a slight, I'd say a slight pickup in the international market, although trade hasn't been particularly busy in the last couple of weeks. Let's look at kernels. And again, we see a slight pickup, particularly on brokens. 320s prices, the dotted red line, as you can see, going back April 16, April 21, through the whole boom and bust of 2017 and early 18. Prices are roughly back to where they were about a year ago. So about a year ago, we would have expected that to happen. We would have expected prices to pick up. From prices around $3.20, we would have expected them at that time to head upwards. And then the pandemic intervened, and we saw, despite record demand for kernels, we saw prices fall away. And it's really only now in the last 3 or 4 weeks that that's recovered. There do seem to be a few more offers. May is not particularly a great month in terms of buying. It's never been a month where buyers, particularly European buyers, will be particularly active in the market. This may bring out a few more offers, particularly from Vietnamese processors, and some forward offers too. It's difficult sometimes to work out whether or not the offers are, a real effort to sell or more related to the current value of RCN. If we look at I think what's really interesting now is this differential between the brokens and the 320s as the benchmark whole grade. And you can see that this is still quite wide. If we go back before the price, the absolutely crazy price boom of July 17 onwards, you see that the differential closed in. It's now beginning to return to these levels, close to those differentials. And I think that there may be that may signal that we're going to see similar price differentials over the coming time. I don't really see broken prices I'm seeing in any particular danger at the moment. And that's good news for processors. It changes the calculation a lot. I still wouldn't be I wouldn't be storing my brokens. If I had brokens, I'd be selling them. But even so, I think that the really deep differentials as we saw last year may be gone for the time being. But, for those who might have stocks of brokens in hand, I keep a close eye on what's going on in the US market, and I keep a close eye on what's going on in the Indian market over the coming months. So that's prices. Not an awful lot to report, as you see, either on prices or on crop developments. So I thought we'd have a look at the Vietnamese situation in terms of imports, exports, and the overall situation on trade. Vietnam is the best way to judge the current trend on trade, because obviously Vietnam supplies most of the world's exported cashews. So if we look at kernels exports from Vietnam, so this map shows the cumulative exports month by month for the first 4.5 months of each year. And if we look at it, what we're seeing is that clearly 2021 is way ahead of any other year that we've ever experienced, up by more than 16.5% to the first half of May. I find that a pretty remarkable number. I think that if we look at certain factors in there, so let's look and see, for example, test the idea, is this increase in exports due to buyers being concerned on freight and the rising freight costs? And the increase now represents about 15 cents a pound. So, I mean, that's significant. It was, freight rates doubled and they trebled, and now they're 5 or 6 times what they were. And that becomes significant for buyers. So what we should be looking for is that the steps from month to month are higher in 2021 than they were in previous years. That would give us an indication that people are accelerating their shipments. As you can see, there is some indication of that. You would see, if we go back to 2020, we know in the early part of 2020, buyers did accelerate during February, during March, but particularly during April, a little bit in order to make sure that they got supplies in obviously a very difficult time when so much was unknown. And if we compare, therefore, maybe 2021 back with 2019 would make more sense. And I think there is an indication of an acceleration of shipments. Is that the driver behind the increase in exports? Actually, I don't think so, but there is an indication that it's there. I don't think that people should write off the idea of increased exports of kernels to simply a technical factor like freight. There is a much deeper and stronger underlying pattern. So let's have a look at the Vietnamese balance sheet. So this is a calculated balance sheet. Look, and I make no apologies here. I don't buy the import figure for RCN for Vietnam declared. I think there is a mistake in it, and I'm taking that into account. I'll explain that in a minute. So this is what we see right now. We would see Vietnam in a pretty cut to the chase. What's the stock? And if we take everything into account, opening stock on the 1st of February. Why the 1st of February? Well, we're taking it that most of the kernels exported in January would actually have been from RCN imported in 2020. And therefore, we have to reboot as of the 1st of February. I'm taking my crop estimate around about 300,000 tons. Whether it's 310 or 320 is not going to change the overall figure very much. We look at export, massive figure for export for the time of year. This is to the 15th of May. And imports, I'll explain imports in more detail in a minute. I've added a correction for the import of Burma kernels from African countries. And we end up with a pretty healthy stock at the moment in Vietnam that should be enough to keep processes going for the time being. Let's have a look at this import figure. So here's the import figures. So this red bar represents imports as declared by Vietnamese authorities for January to April 2021. And these bars represent the comparable figures for 18, 19, and 2020. You can see there is a remarkable change if you were to accept those figures on face value. An additional 853,000 tons, or an increase of 287%. Where is that coming from? Well, it's all in Cambodia, basically. So what the figures are saying is that Vietnam imported an additional 703,000 tons of RCN from Cambodia in 2021. Is that possible? Well, let's look in Cambodia, and let's go back to basics. And let's, instead of looking at tons or dollars, let's look at hectares. So in 2018, Cambodia had about 205,000 hectares planted to cashews, including 50,000 which were non-bearing at that time. Now, plantations from 2018 have continued, but not at the same pace. In previous years, Cambodia was adding about 50,000 hectares per annum, but it has slowed. Why did it slow? Well, it's pretty clear prices in 2018 and 19 were pretty low, and that would have discouraged farmers planting. So if this figure is correct, it would mean that either the hectares in Cambodia are underestimated by 330%, or it would mean that the average yield per hectare in Cambodia is 4 tons. Neither figure is likely. In fact, both figures are relatively unlikely. So what is driving imports into Vietnam, and why are imports up? It's not just Cambodia. There's 150,000 tons additional in here somewhere, apart from the Cambodian figure. So if we look at it, we see that there are increased imports in the period January to April from Cote d'Ivoire, a little bit less, but also from Nigeria, a lot more from Tanzania, and significantly more from Ghana. And if we look at it, the total increase across the 4 countries is 147,500 tons. Now, those 4 countries give us a very good estimation of Vietnam's imports, because in 2019, those 4 accounted for 65% of imports, and in 2018, for 73% of imports. Almost all is covered in this. If we take those 4 countries and add Cambodia, we get a very wide coverage on imports. Therefore, I think this is a very good indicator of what is the reality in Vietnam. And when we look at that, we see that essentially there's no doubt that Vietnam's imports of RCN are well ahead of previous years. We think that's due to mainly Tanzania, but also earlier shipments from Cote d'Ivoire, which is confirmed in Cote d'Ivoire, and a little bit more activity in Ghana, and probably a little bit more activity in Benin too, where Vietnamese buyers took the opportunity while Indian buyers were pretty quiet in Ghana and Benin early in the season for the reasons I've already mentioned, the lockdown and the pandemic. Normally, Indian buyers are very partial to Benin and Ghana RCN, and they use it to bridge the gap for high quality nuts. Benin in particular is very popular in India. So if we look at this, it would seem that yes, Vietnam's imports are well ahead of last year, but not 1.2 million tons, more likely somewhere around about 700,000 tons. And the error, if it is an error, and it may not be an error, because I have a feeling there's something more at play here, is with the Cambodian imports. It doesn't seem possible, and I've heard all kinds of explanations. We're only recording numbers this year. The government in Cambodia doesn't know what their production is. Some of that may be true. But the fact is, they're not so wrong. They're not 300% wrong. And it's not a 4-ton yield per hectare in Cambodia. We know that for a fact. So Vietnam's imports are up due to more from Tanzania, less Indian buying early in the season in West Africa due to the reluctance of Indian buyers as a direct impact of this shocking second wave in India. So if we then look at our balance sheet again, this is where I'm getting the imports figure. And this is where I'm getting my stock balance, just over 500,000 tons. Now that includes afloat and shipped and imported. It does not include committed. So there are much more contracts made in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, in Nigeria, where the nuts will be imported into Vietnam. It doesn't represent the cover. It represents about 84 days of processing. So 84 days of processing is about the time taken to buy a shipment in West Africa and move it to Vietnam in a normal year. It might be a little bit more this year. And what will happen is that period of time, that window will get wider as the season goes on, because we'll start to talk about the ports of Bissau. We'll have to talk about the port of Banjul, and we'll be talking about Ziguinchor. So these are ports where it is more difficult to get shipments out at the moment, and this is one of the problems that this year is showing. So if we look at the current situation, if import continued at this rate, Vietnam needs to import a further 1.3 million tons of RCN. That would give a total of 1.98 million tons, which is 22% up on the previous high figure of 2019. That means, number one, that exports continue at the current rate, and we're going to look at that in a minute. And two, that processing continues at the current rate. So will Vietnam hit a new record imports of RCN this year? And if we have a look, is a 22% increase possible? Well, here are the imports to Vietnam in 2016, 17 up to 2021 projected. It's not an actual number. If we look at this, you do see that there is quite a volatility. It can go up and down with the crop in Vietnam, with the crop in Cambodia, given that some of the Cambodian nuts don't appear in the official figures. Is it possible that it will go to this figure? Well, you could look at it and say there is a rising trend throughout, and perhaps that trend was interrupted in 2020 by the pandemic. But actually, it was also a very large crop. Now, bear in mind that imports from Tanzania in 2020, the 134,000 tons I mentioned earlier, this arrived in 2021. In previous years, more Tanzanian material has arrived earlier, so we need to look at that too. Is it possible? It seems, yes, it is possible. It seems that Vietnam has still got a lot of buying to do. I think whatever way we look at it, Vietnam has still got a lot of buying to do. The question really is, will it be a 1.6 million tons as we saw the previous high in 2019, or will it be this incredible figure, almost 2 million tons of RCN? And secondly, then at that number, at 2 million tons, we have to start asking, is that material available? Will we see at some point huge competition for that material? Or will we see Vietnam get what it needs to process and re-export, and by the time Indian processors come to the market, that they've missed the boat, literally? That product will be gone. And it is possible, and I'm saying possible, and I want to underline that it is possible. I'm not saying it's likely, but it is possible that we see a lot of competition for RCN by the time we get into June, July, depending on how situation develops in India. If the Indian crop is a very big crop, that will be reduced in terms of the demand from India. If the pandemic lockdown continues longer than expected in India, that will impact demand too. So this is a situation that actually foretells the future, because it's clear that the demand for cashew nuts is going to rise in the future. And it's clear that sooner or later we're going to arrive to this position anyway. Will it happen in 2021? I'm not sure. It certainly would have happened if it weren't for the pandemic. So if India was firing on all cylinders on cashews right now, I think there would be extreme competition for RCN. That wouldn't be good for business, by the way. That would be bad for business because it would make prices volatile, but I think it would be there. So there is an interesting period ahead on how this develops. We shouldn't, by the way, miss the fact that a lot of Vietnam's needs are contracted, but they're not yet arrived and some of them are not yet shipped. So it's not saying that Vietnamese buyers have to come in and buy all of this material. They would already have contracted quite a lot of it. So let's look and try and answer the question with regard to demand. Will demand continue at the levels that we've seen so far this year from Vietnam? Now, again, let me underline, we're talking about Vietnam in terms of demand because Vietnam supplies almost 80% of Europe's cashews, 90% of the United States cashews. And between those two, we have almost 50% of world demand. So you take those two together, that's 50%. Take India, 31%. You've covered basically the world in terms of demand. What we're seeing is that shipments. So what I did was I took indicative countries. I took a range of countries, put them together just to see how they were performing in terms of exports from Vietnam. And in some cases, I was able to compare that with imports at the other end in North America and in Europe. And in others, I just took the shipment figures as normal. And if we look at this, we see 7 Asian countries, 7 Asian importers. So this would include countries like Japan, Korea, but it also includes Australia, Thailand, China on its own, not included in the Asian countries, 11 countries in Europe, which are 7 EU countries, 2 Eastern European countries and 2 non-EU countries as a basket. Middle East and North Africa, 6 major importers, North America, Canada and the United States. And when we look at it, we see shipments to Europe are up by 10%. And that's quite significant because European imports have been up by 15% and 17% in the last 2 years. And in 2021, up by 10%. This shows significant growth. This shows that price stability at attractive levels, plus the underlying trends in health, snacking and convenience in Europe are sending cashew demand skywards. If we look at North America, we don't see as bright a picture this year. In fact, if we look at North American imports, we see that although the trend was pretty positive on imports, when we look at shipments from Vietnam, we see a decline. So this may well be an indicator that the shipments probably from February onwards, these are the import figures at March, so there would have been shipments from the latest January. So it looks like shipments from February, March are down a little bit on the previous year. Not hugely significant, but maybe an indicator of what's to come in the US market this year. But when we look at it, and we look at this figure for China, we see something really interesting. So although China is still way behind North America in terms of volumes and quite far behind Europe in terms of volumes, Chinese imports so far in 2021 are really very high. Half of the increase in the exports of cashew kernels from Vietnam is accounted for by business to China. So Vietnam's exports are up by 16.6%. Increase in Europe, increase in the Middle East, decrease in North America, but a very strong increase in China. Let's that's a quick look at China. And if we look at China's, this is January to April, shipments from Vietnam to China. So this would include obviously only recorded shipments. But in the last 3 years, shipments have been pretty well recorded. So I think we can take them as a strong indicator. Now let's leave 2020 out of it, leave it to one side, because we know in 2020 for 4 to 5 weeks, in February and March, there was no movement of trade between the two countries. But even if we compare 2021 to 19, 18, 17, what we're seeing is a 50% increase on the previous high. Is there anything technical there? Let's think about it. Well, could it be taking a seasonal advantage of attracted prices? Possibly, but that wouldn't really. Sorry, would you mind? Hello, could you mute? Okay, so let's return to China. So we have a 50% increase on the previous high in January to April, and we're asking, could this be a technical factor? Could it be freight? I don't think so. It's unlikely. The freight cost is not high enough. Could it be taking advantage of low prices seasonally? It could, but again, that wouldn't fit very well with the structure of the Chinese market. If we look at reports from a range of organizations discussing the consumption of nuts in China, this increase fits much better with an idea that there is a wider use of nuts. And it would seem to indicate that perhaps, finally, China has discovered cashew nuts in a way that could have a significant impact on the bottom line supply-demand balance as we go forward. Okay, we're going to talk about African processing shortly. Let's just wind up on the market. What are the factors to watch in the coming weeks? Look out for news on the Indian crop and demand. Look out too for shortages of other nuts, perhaps almonds. So as India goes into its peak season, August onwards for the festivals, Diwali in particular, you might find that there's a tightness of shipments, almonds possibly the most likely, which could impact positively on cashew demand, assuming that the lockdown has eased by then. And there is every indication that India's lockdown is easing now, but what that really means, time will only tell. Look for buying patterns in Guinea-Bissau and Senegal. Look for issues on logistics, but also look for the presence of Indian buyers. If we're left in a situation where we have only Vietnamese buyers, or only, but mainly Vietnamese buyers, as has been the case, that will have an impact. But if we have competition between Vietnamese and Indian buyers, that's going to make the market a bit more volatile. Normally, Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, as higher priced origins, are more favored by Indian buyers. If they're absent, it'll dampen the market. If they're present and Vietnamese buyers continue to compete, that could heat up the market in those countries. Look at Chinese imports or shipments from Vietnam, as we've just been talking about. Look at the freight situation. We've got a remarkable situation on freight from Asian countries to Europe and to North America. Will that normalize? When will it normalize? When will prices fall? Will buyers seek to wait until that happens? But the window is closing for them. You cannot really delay shipments once you get past May. If you're in the West, you're in the busy season processing for the end of the year, and you can't tell a supermarket that we're waiting for a container from China. You need to pay the price and get on with it. And so the window is narrow, and the opportunity to delay is disappearing. Look for defaults and delays in Asia. it is likely. There are a lot of cheap contracts on kernels made. Some of them are being delayed. Inevitably, some of them will be defaulted. This is creating an opportunity for West African processors. You've got a situation right now where you've got short journey times, available raw material, and delays in Asia. Ideal opportunity if you're in business as a processor to start talking to customers, especially look in Europe. There are more fundamental reasons why European buyers should be talking to West African processors, but this is just one short-term opportunity to start talking to them. Look at the US imports too. The figures so far suggest that the US might well go back to very, very low growth, maybe no growth in cashew imports this year. That's not altogether surprising. Growth in the US market over 5 years up to 2019 was relatively slow. It accelerated last year. I said at the time I felt that was driven by the pandemic. It looks like I was right on that, and it's calming down again. I don't think it has a huge impact on the market. That is, I don't think that slow growth or maybe no growth has a huge impact on the market overall. The market's not been driven by growth from North America. It was a pandemic situation last year, but it wasn't the same thing in Europe, and it certainly wasn't the same thing in China. So this year, when we look at demand, we see, from what we know now, we see Europe continuing on the expected trend, China coming to the market maybe more than we expected. We see the Middle East and North Africa recovering, demand recovering, particularly in the early part of the year, increased shipments all around, and we see relatively stable shipments in Asia. So we're not seeing a reaction of demand to the pandemic in any negative way. We're seeing either continued positive trend or a return to normality. And the question is, I don't think there's a real question as to whether there's enough RCN in the world to meet demand. There is. But whether it'll be in the right place at the right time is the question. And if you're a farmer holding RCN or an exporter of RCN, or a buyer of RCN indeed, that's the big question for you right now. So let's have a look at processing in Africa. So I'm going to try and take a very general look at the overall situation on processing in Africa and try to answer the question, is it different this time? So why do I ask that question? Well, this is probably the fourth generation of processing in African countries, going right back to the 1970s. And we've seen successes, we've seen failures, we've seen changes. But this time it does appear that African processing is following the trend. It is mainly commercially driven. Private investors, private businesses, it's not as reliant on interventions from development agencies as it was at times in the past. If we look at the overall situation, new processors in Africa are mechanized. They're of much larger scale than in the past. They are going for their food safety certifications, and quality management is a major factor for them. So we are seeing a professionalization of processing. One has only to look in Côte d'Ivoire, in Benin, in Mozambique to see examples. And I think one of the things that's most interesting is that there are new models of processing in Africa, and people are looking at it a different way. I'll just give you some different examples from different countries. I'm not going to name the companies in question, but for example, we see a case of multinational processor building a high capacity factory, a very high capacity factory indeed, based on excellence in processing, already with access to finance and with a separate dedicated marketing function. This is competitiveness based on scale. We're big, we're smart, and we know how to sell. And that's one model that we can see in action in West Africa. We're also seeing a slightly different kind of a business, a foreign and national partnership. Again, a large-scale processor. In the case I'm talking about, very well linked both to European buyers and to local farmer groups. And a lot of time and money has been spent on linking to local farmer groups. And this is a competitiveness based on processing knowledge, but also based on partnership and sustainability. And this type of a business is very well suited to supplying the European market and will find a lot of support in Europe. So these two models have two things in common. One, professionalism, and two, scale. Key things, and if we look at lessons learned in Vietnam in particular, those two things were big drivers. Last week or 2 weeks ago, you remember we spoke about India versus Vietnam, and we talked about management, technology, and the linkage of those two things together. There are other models. So we have an example of a medium-scale processor. Difficult for a medium-scale processor to be competitive. But how this operation is doing it is they're adding more value. They're packing consumer packs. So they're looking to high-value specialist markets in consumer packs, bringing that product from $800 a ton off the field to $22, $23 a kilo in the consumer packs. And that high level of value addition requires a lot. It requires excellence in marketing, excellence in processing, excellence in food safety. But it works, and it is a way for a medium-scale processor to be competitive. These are all real businesses, by the way, all four of them. And the fourth one, this is an existing food brand that's currently building an integrated supply chain. So direct linkage to farmers, creation of farmer groups, education of farmers, support of farmers. They're doing that in partnership with a development organization who works on the farmers. They work on the process. And they're exporting a specialized branded product, high-value consumer pack, and they're selling it to the US market. And here we have competitiveness based on branding and marketing. So what we see is the question of, can we compete on costs? One way to address that is add value. Add higher values so you're at a much higher level on your sales revenue. Branding and marketing sometimes allows you to do that. And then, of course, we talk about scale allows you to address the issue of costs right from the beginning. So these four examples, all real countries, real companies in four different countries, and some of you will be able to guess who they are, but I'm not going to mention the names, all successfully operation, all relatively new. None of them new this year or last, but all relatively new, all successful and all competitive. And this is a key factor in African processing. Not all factories are following one of these models, but these are standing out as success stories. So let's look at this issue of costs and remind ourselves, first of all, there is a struggle in African countries to match Vietnam's processing costs. India doesn't match Vietnam's processing costs either, by the way. But look at this. If we look at the capacity, huge capacity in Vietnam versus a relatively small production, huge capacity in India versus quite a large production scale, and then in West Africa, the opposite. Only really in Brazil is the processing capacity and the production matched to each other. And if we look at costs, we see that cost of raw material is the light blue. The grey is the cost of bringing it to market. And then you have this kind of petrol blue color, which is the on cost for processing. And you see this is quite high in Africa for a variety of reasons. And when we look at it overall, what we see is that in Vietnam, if we take direct comparison with African RCN, and I've just taken the 1200, by the way, as an arbitrary number to give us an indication. we see a low cost of processing and a high cost of moving the product to market. So Vietnamese processors, naturally enough, with low cost of moving to market for their domestic crop and for the Cambodian crop, do outstandingly well on that, but it's more difficult for them when they're paying rather high costs to move raw material to market. They import about 80% of their raw material, about 60% from African countries. So going back to Africa, what we see low cost of processing in Vietnam, higher cost of access to raw material, and in India, higher cost of processing, but a protected domestic market. It does cost more on average to process in India, but the domestic market is protected and the price of kernels is much higher. So I think today it's around $3.70 for 320s. If we look in Africa, higher cost of processing, but lower cost of access to raw material. At least in theory, if you've got a properly developed supply chain. So really what we're talking about is this gap, cost in processing, compared to this gap, cost in bringing the product to market. And if the combination of the two can be matched, we've got a competitive African processing sector. Now, I put in 600 as the cost of processing, but modern processors, people like the examples I've just given, are not in that league. I've seen and spoken to processors whose costs would be about 30%, maybe more, lower than that. So modern processors in African countries are competitive and they are closing the gap. Now, it's easy to listen to ideas of, I've even read it yesterday, that the lack of productivity of labor, the Africa will never process. This is often emanating from people who basically prefer making money out of trading RCN. And actually, when we think about labor issues are management issues. This is an issue of training and management. It's not an issue that cannot be solved. And I think it's important to bear in mind too that I've recently looked at a processing plant that'll process about 5,000 tons. It'll have 137 workers. 137 workers, a modern factory. That's not going to be an issue of labor. So I think that it is likely that this generation of African processors will close the gap somewhat. I don't expect African processors to reach the figures that Vietnamese processors claim. Sometimes I doubt whether those figures are really accurate, but in any case, it's not going to happen that they're going to be directly competitive, but they are going to be close to the raw material. And indeed, they're going to be close to the market. So let's make a little comparison between the two. And this is the general situation as it stands today. We'll just focus on Africa. And if we look at processing in Africa, the use of technology is relatively recent. It's mostly Vietnamese or Italian from Ultramare. The ownership type of the business is quite varied now. So you do have SMEs, you do have corporations, including multinationals, and there are a few social enterprises, but generally commercial enterprises with social objectives. So they're our businesses or they're run like businesses. New investment is high compared to India, for example, where it's relatively slow for the time being. Operational plants in Africa, I reckon about 50. That is probably a little bit lower due to the pandemic. Certainly last year it was. The average scale is around 3,000 tons, but that's rapidly increasing. And if you were to, for example, look in particular countries, you would find that figure is much higher. If you looked in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, you'd find that figure is much higher. In general, the food safety certification in the modern factories is evolving. People are getting their certification. There are a handful of BRC or IFS certified businesses. There are many HACCP certified businesses. Compared to India, where that's still relatively low, This is driven mainly by the market. So it's low because that's what the market demands. And it's medium in Vietnam. You cannot say better than that. It's not, in Vietnam, food safety practice is not as advanced as sometimes we might be led to believe in the cashew sector. If we look at working conditions, I think in general, we should say that working conditions in African factories that are recently built are moderate, not bad. We see huge variation in Vietnam between the good factories and the very small factories, particularly the shelling stations, particularly in remote villages. And that should be borne in mind too. Social certification. So here I'm talking about corporate responsibility, sustainable practices, CDEX, and other certifications like that. Much more common in African processing units than elsewhere, especially in West Africa. Problems, really, access to finance is a huge issue. So what we see is progress, still relatively small scale, still relatively small number of factories, but the development in certification, food safety, social certification over a relatively short period of time. I mean, if you think about the Indian industry took 100 years, Vietnam much quicker, about 30, 35 years to develop in a remarkable performance. And the African industry is now version 4, let's say, but it does seem to be making some progress. So if we look at the progress in terms of volume in African processing, what we see is quite a steady trend in terms of the volumes processed. But this has been interrupted by difficult situation last year in particular. Many factories didn't open. Many factories had problems with the pandemic. And I think that situation will be reversed, but probably not in 2021. If we look at this as a percentage of the crop, we see that in actual fact, the percentage of the crop processed may not be the best measure. It's been declining over the last 10 years, but this is because if we look at production, take a quick look at the production figures, production in West Africa has been booming. So the production has been increasing, and this is why be careful about looking at numbers that talk about the percentage of the crop processed, because when you get that kind of growth in production, there's no way that this figure, the percentage of the crop processed, is likely to keep up with that. So it's around about 9% in 2020 of the crop was processed at origin in African countries. A big significant factor in that was the increase in the export of the unpeeled or Burma kernels, as they're called, part processing kernels. Vietnam imported just under 20,000 tons of Burma kernels in 2019. And this year, I think it's somewhere in the region of about 2,000 a month. So this is one of the drivers of African processing, but it's not full processing. And there's a lot to be said about that, but it's may well give a certain impression that's slightly more positive than reality. Let's compare East and West. So it is very much a tale of two different regions. If we look in East Africa, we see a decline in processing in Tanzania over the past, well, really over the past 6 years, 5-6 years, we've seen this decline in processing. And this was really, I think, it was due to a number of factors. Olam closed their factory in Tanzania, which was a big factor, of course. I think also that the linkage to the auction system and the insistence that the nuts should be bought through the auction system was a big impediment to the development of processing. Now, they've made it very clear now, I mean, it's taken a long time, but they made it very clear now that processors in Tanzania can buy direct from farmers. Exactly how that works remains to be seen. But I think that's a factor. And there are, to my knowledge, 5 major projects in hand. I don't think all of them will happen, but there are 5 major processing projects in hand in Tanzania. And there is a good opportunity there. You've got great quality product, opposite season, good processing yields, and a history of processing, although that's been declining in recent years. If we look in Mozambique, you see that Mozambique has been declining. This is related to competitiveness in the process. I think it's related to problems in marketing, particularly in marketing broken kernels, which was discouraging. And I think it's probably also, we should say, and we'll talk about it a bit later, it's also a fact that the regulation of the supply chain hasn't worked as well as it might have done. If we look in West Africa, what we've seen is that incentivization works. We see that the subsidies in Côte d'Ivoire have really boosted production. But we have to also recognize that this was increasing before the subsidies were introduced. Processing volumes were increasing in any case. That's been interrupted in 2020, very much due to the pandemic situation. In Ghana and Benin, you see something of a decline in the processing volume in recent years. It's difficult to be a processor in Benin. You're working with good raw material, early crop in West African terms, very much favored by Indian buyers. And it's difficult to compete because those buyers are prepared to pay higher prices for the RCN. Same thing in Ghana. There isn't a lot of cashew processing in Ghana today, although there is good raw material and there is an increasing production, and Ghana will become a major producer in years to come. So what we're seeing is a progress. We're seeing progress in Côte d'Ivoire, in Benin, in Nigeria, and we're seeing some, what I'm calling green shoots, small processing units developing further west in the Gambia, in Guinea-Bissau, and there is now a processing factory in Guinea too. So there is some progress, and it's been quite positive, and it's now going through, let's say, a little bit of a crisis. If we look at sector strategies, and a lot is talked about government in West Africa particularly, and its impact on the sector. So if we look at them across these 6 areas, direct subsidies, supply chain intervention or management, access to finance, linkage to farmers, technical support for processing, and tax concessions. And what we see is that direct subsidies have worked really well in Côte d'Ivoire. Now, it should be recognized that they have supported new factories that needed it, and they've supported old factories that probably didn't. And there is a question mark there over the long-term efficiency of a subsidy system. Now, the subsidies, I think, are in place for the first 5 years of business, which seems reasonable. What will happen after that? Hopefully, those factories will be up, running, and efficient. If we look at the supply chain interventions, we see a whole range of policies and regulations. We see export windows, we see minimum prices, but we even see a ban on RCN export. And all of these different things have really proved difficult to implement. It's been gotten so wrong so many times. What should the minimum price be, including this year? How should it be implemented? How do you control cross-border trade? How do you enforce this supply chain intervention? And really, whereas I would say, really on the one hand, it has had a positive impact on farmer prices and certainly introduced a level of transparency, it hasn't really helped processing a great deal. Processors who've got good supply chains have done it themselves. Access to finance across Africa in many, many different sectors is the issue, not just in cashews. So this is right across all of these sub-Saharan African economies. If we look at specific to cashews, I think there's 2 things here that make it difficult for banks and investors. One is the lack of information and the quality of the information on the sector. And secondly, the risk profile of the sector. Now, to a certain extent, the risk profile is self-serving because this industry, let's be honest about it, this industry is mostly dominated by people who trade RCN in Africa, and that risk profile kind of suits them. If we look at price volatility, which is not in their control, that's a big factor. And I think if I were a banker or a financier looking at cashews, I'd be looking at the volatility of prices and thinking to myself, this is a problem. This is a major issue. Linkage to farmers, we know that that's effective, and we've seen it in cases, including the 4 examples I've given you earlier, but it's not been well done. A lot of work on production, a lot of increase in production, very little on actually linking farmers to processors. Technical support, that is now happening. Linkage to technical facilities, machines, managers, we're seeing that beginning. Governments, helped by development agencies, have understood that. A lot of that at the moment is international linkage, but in time that will become national linkage. African businesses in management, African businesses in eventually manufacturing of the equipment will happen. And tax concessions, there are tax concessions just about in every country, but really they're only effective if these other factors are in place. So sector strategies have been good and bad for processors in African countries. Some of the supply chain interventions, export windows, for example, haven't worked very well. Others have been difficult to implement. Others have been impossible to enforce. For me, key things here are the access to finance, linkage to farmers, and technical support. These are 3 areas that need work. The linkage to farmers and technical support are 2 very specific cashew issues, and I know ACA is doing its bit in those areas. Access to finance is a much broader sector-wide economic issue. So if we look at some of the problems, and I'm talking here about problems that have slowed the development of processing and the lessons that we can learn from the success in India and especially in Vietnam. And these are my personal opinions, by the way. First problem is the poacher turned gamekeeper problem, as I call it. Processors whose first priority is trading RCN or Burma kernels. This is holding back the development of processing. Secondly, what I call the price fixation. So essentially processors who don't understand their own competitive advantages, maybe advantages in location, traceability, sustainability, issues which are hot for consumers and buyers of kernels. But basically these processors continue to listen to the dialogue, you're not as cheap as Vietnam, therefore you're not going to be in business. Not true. This price fixation has held back the development. Short-termism, the lack of long-term thinking. I mean, this kind of investment is a long-term investment. Short-termism, opportunistic trading, that trading culture linked to the poacher turned gamekeeper is a major issue. Policies, and I'm going to say good policies, but poor implementation. For me, these are a real issue. You see plenty of good policies, but you see very poor implementation right across the sector. Poor technical support has been an issue. Poor technical support, I mean, compare the emphasis on production and growing with the technical support given to processing, let's say from over the last 20 years, for example. So most emphasis has been on production and it's worked, but it hasn't generally been accompanied by a professional, knowledgeable, technically adept support for processing. People given wrong advice about things like the scale of their factory, wrong advice about how to source machines, poor advice about how to manage. And a lot of these other factors being taken as fact. These are the problems that I mentioned here. And finally, I'd mention this, what I call the build and they will come thinking. The build and they will come means that, it's a quote from an American film, by the way. It means that they will build a factory, forget about the buyers until the day the warehouse starts to fill up with kernels. And it doesn't work that way for lots of different reasons, but it's just not the type of relationship that buyers are looking for. So if you build and hope they will come, but they will be a discount trader, importer looking for an opportunistic deal who will tell you you're too high priced and you need to be cheaper than Vietnam before they'll even think of buying from you. So these are some of the issues. And most of those are very easily fixed. The difficult one probably is this one, poor implementation of policy. But the rest of it is a way of thinking and a way of planning. And it can be addressed by individual businesses, or it can be addressed by the sector as a whole. So, in summary, African processing is on the up, slowly, but it's not without its difficulties. But is it interesting for kernels buyers? Do they want African processing? Will they support it? Let's have a look at some of the factors. So I think African processing is interesting for kernels buyers. I know it is, because a lot of them ask me about it. What's going on? Where can they buy African kernels? And we think about 4 issues in particular. First of all, the growing dependence on a single origin, Vietnam. It's not that it's Vietnam, it's just that it's a single country. In 2009, the United States sourced 45% of its cashews in Vietnam and 26% in India, 24% in Brazil. Quite a healthy mix. But in 2019, that was 86% in Vietnam, only 3% in India, and only 4% in Brazil. African share had increased from 3 to 5%. So this dependence is a factor for buyers. Some realize it, some don't. By the way, the 5% is a little bit better than it looks, because bear in mind the US market had grown year on year from 2009 to 2019. So the actual volume went up by more than it might appear on that share. But the issue is share. Consumption generally has been going up. All markets have been showing growth. This is fantastic. This makes you feel very positive to be in the cashew business when you look at a chart like that. And this is up to 2019. 2020 was higher again. And 2021, by the looks of things, could be higher again. So this is another factor for buyers. If we look at the trends, so if we particularly focus on consumer trends, and we look at these 3, so these are 5 big trends for consumers, and we look at 3 particular trends. Food safety, which becomes easier if you're located closer to production. Sustainability, not only eliminating that huge journey, the 28,000 kilometer journey of West African cashews to market in the United States, for example. Sustainability becomes much easier if you process closer to origin, apart from the impact of the long journey. And finally, the whole idea of transparency in our food chain. Traceability, the story of the product, and the story of the people behind the product. These are the kind of things that retailers and manufacturers and ultimately the consumer is looking for. And they're real. If you joined us 2 sessions back when Lars Shearer from Aldi joined us and spoke about sustainability and their views on it, you'll realize that these are major trends in the market. If we look finally then in this area and we think about the the threats to long-term demand growth, and we think about some of these factors, let's have a look at some of these. All of these factors could bring shock impact on demand. These could reverse these positive trends. All of them can be partially resolved by processing closer to origin and by diversifying the countries that process. Things like labour scandal, poor environmental practice, trade in that breaks the rules of origin, social responsibility and traceability. These are major factors. So we have strong arguments in favour of support by buyers for processing in African countries. If we look at the impact of the pandemic, briefly, we'll see that there are factors over the last 18 months that are impacting this too. The pandemic highlighted the weaknesses in the chain, including dependence on a single origin. The pandemic, not only just in cashews, but in all food products, demonstrated the risk of long supply chains. It demonstrated the need for transparency and traceability. The need, in effect, all of these factors add up to shorter, nearer supply chains and more resilient supply chains that can withstand the shocks of an event like we've just seen over the past 17 or 18 months. If we look in the longer term and we think about the impact of what we talked about way back in February in this event, February 10th, I think it was, we talked about the new cashew world. And we talked about a change from the focus solely on cost efficiency to now on more resilient and adaptable supply chains. We talked about the impact of the health, social and economic crisis, giving reason for people to look at sustainability differently. So it ceases to become a vague notion that 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, the temperatures might be higher and the climate more severe, and it becomes very real. And it causes this change from lean manufacturing, 1980s, 1990s philosophy, into a much more sustainable manufacturing. And sustainability as a way of doing business, as a way of remaining profitable, but doing business in a slightly different way, which is a factor that is in favor of processing close to origin. And when we look at all these factors, and we're looking at the African cashew sector, we really need to ask ourselves, are we really thinking long term in the way this sector is developing? Is this short-termism, failure to implement policies, failure to offer technical support? And despite all of these things, processing is growing. Are we thinking long term? And that's an issue I'm going to address during the next ACA Global Market Encounter, when we're going to talk about, well, we've got a title on it, we're going to call it 2030, Don't Look Back in Anger. In other words, take advantage of the opportunity in Africa and don't be looking back 10 years from now thinking about what should have been done. So I'll finish by asking a question in terms of how can African processing help buyers' needs? We talked about sustainable, traceable, quality, food safety, agile markets, closer markets, shorter supply chains. And we talked about how can African processing help and benefit. Firstly, through traceability and transparency. It's best achieved by processing closer to the point of origin and integrating the processors into the supply chain, both of which are happening, but happening relatively slowly in African countries. And if we look at this issue of risk and diversification, if African countries processed just 40% of their RCN, the dependence of Europe and the US on a single origin, today Vietnam, could be reduced from an average 82% to an average 33%. In other words, processing 40% of the RCN in African countries, roughly 4 times what's done today, would bring us back to a relatively balanced risk situation like we had last in 2009. So thank you for your attendance and attention this morning. I'd be happy to listen to any comments or to answer any questions. I'll hand you back to Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's been a good pleasure listening to you and also getting insight into Cashewnomics 2, where you have given an update, but also deep dive into African processing. Particularly what is important is talking about the poacher tent gatekeeper problem. I think it has been there for many years. And one of the other aspects of it is that most of these entrants who then are coming from buyer backgrounds have issues also with liquidity because, money is money. And when they transition into processing, it becomes a big issue for them there. And then also the issue of build and they will come. Thinking for us, what we have seen also is the other dimension of it, of investing in infrastructure and then now looking for investors to come or financing to come for the right kind of equipment and the rest. So I really, it is very good, the problems that you have enumerated. And these are also the things that ACA and development partners and governments will be looking at in terms of attracting more and more people into the sector. What kind of people are we attracting, and what is the information out there? So thank you very much, Jim. But then there are a couple of questions. The first one has to do with the processing in Africa, processing costs in Africa vis-a-vis processing costs in Vietnam for using the case of the processing of raw cashew nuts from West Africa and not from Cambodia. It does seem, maybe if you go to that slide, where you have the processing cost comparison. Hello, Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yeah. It'll come up on the video.
Okay, very good. Yeah, exactly. No, please go back. Yeah, okay, very good. Thank you very much. So if you look at this, it does seem that in terms of comparison between West Africa and Vietnam, African RCN, there is really no difference actually in terms of overall cost. So where lies the real competitive advantage or comparative advantage of Vietnam over West Africa when it comes to processing of RCN coming from African origin?
Well, the competitive advantage is being the market leader, having a capacity to process probably 3 million tons if needed. That doesn't change overnight. This possible match, we take 200 plus 350, that's 550, a little bit of tax, compared to 660 is only for matched factories. So you're not selling if you don't have food safety. You're not selling if you don't have scale. So it doesn't matter what your costs are if you don't meet the basic buyer requirements, first of all. So if we take factories that meet the basic buyer requirements, in other words, have, for example, a minimum of a HACCP system in place, then they should be competitive. But if you've got a factory that doesn't have those things, they're not going to be competitive in any circumstances. If you have a factory where the costs, because it's a more complex issue than we can just see there. If we have a factory, for example, which is breaking 35% of the nuts,
okay,
it's not going to be competitive. If you have a factory which can process at a competitive cost but doesn't have any money to buy the raw nuts at the start of the season, or worse, decides that they do have the money, but it's better just to trade them on as RCN in this kind of short-term thinking, obviously they're not going to be competitive. So my point is that an efficient West African factory can be competitive.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So
it doesn't mean that they exist.
Okay. All right. So it is clear for just so that nobody gets any wrong impression here. the cost might be the same, but then you also have to compare with what kind of returns are coming. And the returns are very much a factor of the end product. How many more brokens you have vis-a-vis the holes and the other factors like having the buyer arrangements and the rest, and then also certification. So I think it is clear to highlight those. So that,
yeah, well, I think, look, if you're listening to a story, you have to listen to the story and not just to the conclusion. So, I mean, processing, as I've said throughout, is about, yes, it's about cost, and this is an area that African factories have struggled with, but it's also about all of those other factors that make a factory efficient. And the two areas that I see the issue of cost being addressed successfully. I see the issue of scale being addressed successfully. I see the issues of management moving in the right direction. The big gaps for me at the moment would be a proper integration of the supply chain. Now, actually, that doesn't happen elsewhere, a proper integration of the supply chain, because it doesn't really exist in Vietnam, for example. 80% or 80% plus of the raw material is imported anyway. But even within the country, the integration of the supply chain is not as it would be ideally. So that would be an area of advantage. And the final area relates to some of these things, some of the problems, the build and they will come, the short-term thinking, the failure to implement policies, the poacher turned gamekeeper. A lot of these issues are very major issues in competitiveness. So competitiveness is not just about cost. People focus on cost because it's easy. It's easy to say it costs $600 there and $200 there. You can never be competitive. But you have to take all the other factors into account too. But on the other hand, if you look at this, if you're competitive with cost-wise, one of the key things to cost competitiveness is that number for the sourcing of the raw material. So if we just take a look at that again, and we look at this, I put in $60 here, set $60 per ton of RCN compared to $350. It may be that 60 for some factories is 120 or more.
Okay.
So you need to develop, as a processor, you need to pay attention to the supply chain. I say build and they will come, and that I mentioned with regard to buyers, but it could also be said of with regard to suppliers. And the idea, I mean, I've heard people say things like, well, I'm going to put a factory up on the main road and the trucks passing by will drop the RCN into me. Doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. So I think people have to spend more time developing their supply chain and ensuring that they will have sufficient raw material to make their factory work.
Very good. Now, before I move on, there's also a question here. What is the demand supply scenario of RCN in recent times? We have seen the demand for kernel, the supply, but really for RCN, you might have touched on it still, but maybe if you can clarify some more, yeah.
Recent times being recent weeks, I guess. So I'll answer it on that basis. It's been relatively quiet. So what we've seen in recent weeks is we've seen a little bit of a scramble for raw material in Ivory Coast, where exporters have been looking to pick up material to meet export orders. They'd sold big chunks of RCN and they needed to meet the export orders. And that was at its height about 3 weeks ago. It's eased off a little bit since then. There are significant commitments made for export. Meantime, in Benin, the season is coming to a close. Most business has already been done. Similarly in Ghana, similar in Burkina. And we're in a little bit of a hiatus between the early Nigeria to Cote d'Ivoire region, and we're just coming into the further west, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, the Gambia, for exports from those countries. So it's kind of a calm position between the two. I think what people would like to see more than anything, buyers would like to see, is more shipments coming out. And then we'll get a clue as to whether the season ends up very tight or whether there is enough RCN around. I don't think there's a crisis of supply by any means, but I think that there may well emerge some competition between India and Vietnam, depending on what happens in India over the coming 4 or 5 weeks.
The next question has to do more with the Vietnam situation and forecasted 1.9 million imports.
That's not a forecast. That's a statement that's what can happen if the current trend continued.
Continues. Okay, very good. So the question then is it more a redistribution of processing from India, or it is more an upscaling or expansion of capacity within Vietnam itself, regardless of whatever is happening in India is?
Well, if we look at India, over the last, I suppose you'd have to say over the last 15 years, India, for good reason, let me say, has kind of turned inward on cashews. Indian processors have supplied Indian consumers with cashews that they have bought in their own country and abroad, about 50-50. So the Indian industry has increased steadily year on year up to last year for as long as I can remember. And that's mainly been based on domestic consumption. What's happened last year is that the disruption in India caused processing volumes to reduce, and Vietnam was able to supply some customers in the Middle East, for example, where Indian cashews are normally more popular, in Japan, same situation, and it would appear that Vietnam has taken a bigger share in those markets. It's not really a redistribution. What it is a rise in processing everywhere. More cashews are being eaten by more people in more countries every year, and therefore more cashews are being processed. Most of that has ended up being processed in Vietnam, and therefore their industry grows. But it's also the case that more cashews are consumed in India, and therefore processing in India has also increased. Different styles between the two countries, and if you were with us the last time, you'll have seen the contrast in the presentation, India versus Vietnam.
Now, the question, I know you also talked about it briefly, but then will there be enough future demand for the kernels being produced by Vietnam if this growth continues? You've talked about 10% growth in EU11, and which is more or less evened out by the decline in the North America. But again, you've also explained that China is growing rapidly. Overall, given all these scenarios, will there be in the future sufficient growth to absorb the growth in Vietnamese production here?
Okay, well, let's get a few things clear here. When we talk about the balance between the US and EU growth this year, we're only talking about January to April 2021. If we step back from this and look at US demand since 2010, as you can see on the screen, it's only been going in one direction. If we look at EU demand over the same period, it's only been going in one direction. And the growth, what has happened is that growth in the European Union has been accelerating, but growth in the United States has been relatively calm. You're looking at 1-2% in the US market year on year, but the European market has tended to go through growth spurts, if you like to call them. And if you look back 12, 13, 14, you see fast growth. And if we look at this again, 17, 18, 19, and 20, if it were there, we would see fast growth. So it's pretty likely. And if you look back to some of the earlier GME events, you'll see predictions on demand and supply. And given the current rate of the increase in demand and the current rate of the increase in supply, production, in other words, what's likely to happen is that within 5 years, there'll be a structural shortage. For this year, and it's cashews, so we always come back to the short-term conversation, unfortunately. For this year, I don't think that there's a huge problem of enough supply to meet demand. We do need to keep an eye on this. We need to keep an eye on demand in India, demand in China in particular. But what the market really, for growth to continue at these rates, what the market needs is relative price stability. Sure, prices can move up a little bit, they can move down a little bit, but we don't want to see 50, 60 cents a pound up to $1 a pound movements. This is bad for business for lots of reasons. But in short, is there a significant shortage of cashews this year? No, I don't think so. Is there a structural long-term shortage emerging? Probably. But that's over the longer period.
All right, thank you very much. At the last session, when you presented on Cashewnomics 1, there was a question whether someone is manipulating the data somewhere. And now for this session, we have seen the 703,000 tons from Cambodia and the issues surrounding it. What is your take on that question last week session? And then what is emerging with the data from in terms of production from Cambodia?
Well, we think that the trade data is not accurate, but I'm not saying that that's a deliberate manipulation. It could be, but I'm not saying it is. In fact, it's probably just an error. Therefore, I think that in that specific data, we need to look at how that can be corrected and how it can be calculated properly. However, we all know that the interpretation of data is highly subjective and it basically comes down to propaganda. It's one of the issues that we face. So, I mean, people have taken that figure and essentially, if Vietnam says it's imported 1.25 million tons of RCN already, well, the game is over. It's all in warehouses in Vietnam. Why we can just close up for this year. But it's clearly not correct. So some people take that kind of either the lack of information or errors or omissions in the information and try to use it for short-term price advantage. There are strategic issues in the market at the moment. I mean, one would have to ask, is it really likely that Vietnamese cashew processing can continue with such a high dependence on imported raw material, over 80% of the raw material imported? Countries like Cote d'Ivoire, like Cambodia, like Nigeria, Ghana, they all want to develop their own processing industry. Would Vietnam be better, instead of concentrating on scale, to concentrate on higher levels of value addition, which might end up creating even more jobs and more opportunities? You'd have to ask a question, is it likely that if China becomes a major importer of cashew kernels, would it not make more sense for Chinese businesses to buy the RCN themselves and process it in China, or to invest in processing in African countries? And we've seen Chinese investors very active in African countries. So there are a lot of strategic questions. And unfortunately, we do have errors in the information, and those are exploited to try and put across certain points of view. And one of our jobs here is, insofar as possible, to be independent when we look at the information. I mean, if you've listened to me before, you'll know I'm pro African cashews, but at the same time, I'm not one who believes that propaganda makes any sense anytime. And so therefore we try to stay as independent as possible. Is the data being manipulated? Yeah, for sure. No question about it. Which data? Who knows? We can't therefore point at any particular thing. We'll look out for interpretations of data which suit particular opinions. We've heard over the years, we've heard such crazy ideas about you'll never process in Africa, you'll never be able to be competitive. And today we see cases where businesses are competitive, they're doing the job well, and in many ways they're doing the job better. So we need to look at the reality and not just the propaganda.
All right. So thank you very much, Jim. We need to look at the reality and not the propaganda. And our job here is to bring you the information that allows you to make the right kind of decisions in the midst of all the data and information out there, some of which cannot be relied on. So, Jim, I will at this stage want you to discuss more about the next session where you are looking at Cashewnomics 3, and then which areas you'll be deep diving in, and for us to know what to expect. I know the next session is coming on the 16th of June, 2020. So please take us through what to expect.
Sure. Well, next time we're going to look at the third in our 3 Cashewnomics events. We're going to talk about the market to open up, and who knows what events will happen between now and then. Cashewnomics 2030, let's not look back in anger, is about the opportunity that's in the cashew sector at the moment and ways in which we can take advantage of that, and basically putting ourselves forward into 2030, looking back and saying, well, let's hope we're looking back and that we're looking back positively and not in anger at an opportunity lost. Thanks very much for your attention today. Thank you, Ernest, for the opportunity. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thanks to all the participants. Until we come your way again on the 16th of June, 2020, it's bye from here, and take care and stay safe.
Recording stopped.
Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the Premium Edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now of the ACA Cashew Barometer.
Hi, I'm Salma. I'm the CEO of Ivoirienne de Noix de Cajou. Today, cashews are faceless, and our aim is to give cashews an identity. More than 40% of raw nuts in the world are produced in Ivory Coast, and we believe the cashew identity should be African. So we set up this factory to connect the value chain between the farmers and the consumers. The farmers are fragmented and the consumers are disconnected, and we are here as the processor to connect the two and tell you the story. And this is the story about creating jobs for women and youth in a country that has grown cashews historically but not processed.
Je m'appelle Amani Loukou Charlotte. Mon village c'est Djedou en Ouzé. J'ai 7 enfants. C'est Chandanakate là je prends pour faire école.